In the 11th and 12th centuries, the control of northwest France was constantly passed around to different dukes and counts. This was because they were all in conflict with each other over this very valuable piece of territory. One of the men with a stake in this territory was William the Conqueror. He gained control of it, and in 1066 he mounted an invasion to conquer the prosperous Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England, along with conquering northern England and South Wales in later years. William's death proved to be problematic, however, as his children had no idea how the line of succession would work and decided to fight multiple wars over the division and control of these lands. Henry I was one of these men, and after the death of his elder brother William Rufus, he seized power and invaded and captured the Duchy of Normandy, which had been previously controlled by Robert Curthose, his eldest brother. Now Henry I was not only the King of England, but he was also the Duke of Normandy, and this led to a lot of conflict for him. And his control of Normandy was challenged quite often, but most notably by Louis VI of France, and this led to a rebellion in the duchy between 1116 and 1119. Henry did manage to win and actually had a very favorable peace settlement in 1120 that declared that Henry's son, William Adelin, would inherit the title of Duke. Now, William was Henry's favorite child from both personal record and knowledge, but also from a dynastic point of view. Henry I has 25 known children, but he only had two of which who were legitimate, with William being the only legitimate son. Now, since Henry was both King of England and Duke of Normandy, he often had an obligation to go to the continent and see what was going on with his lands over there. And during this time period, he would often set William up as the regent of England during his father's campaigns. And by all record, he performed quite well. It was all setting him up to be quite the fine ruler for the future. On the 25th of November, the royal court of King Henry I was located in a port in France. They were all in high spirits as they were just about to return to England directly after the previously mentioned peace settlement had been reached between Henry I and Louis VI. This group consisted of many noblemen and noblewomen of both French and English backgrounds. And much of this group consisted of the children of these counts, barons, and other nobles, all of whom were important to the next generation of nobility, and who were also friends of Prince William. Now, Prince William was generally known as the pampered prince. What he wanted, he usually received it, and the reason why this is brought up was because his flight of fancy at this time was to go across the English Channel on a new model of ship, the White Ship. The captain, one Thomas Fitzstephen, was obviously not going to turn down a request from both King Henry and Prince William, and so that night the White Ship held around 300 passengers, the makeup being around 160 nobles, 50 or so oarsmen, and 90 other high-born passengers. Many of these were Prince William's friends and siblings who he obviously invited on board with him. And due to the revelry already present in the group, the prince, trying to keep all the fun continuing, ordered for many casks of wine to be put on board, and before the ship even left, most aboard of it were already quite soused. This included the crew members. And before the ship left harbor, clerics came by to bless it. This was generally routine because this was the maiden voyage of the craft and it was just seen as good luck. The clerics, however, were unable to finish their prayers because they were evicted from the ship by all the revelers on board. Having both an inebriated crew and the unfortunate omen of the unfinished prayers struck many warning signs into the heads of some of the passengers, and a few did get off the ship before it left, most notably Stephen of Blois, who will be reappearing later on. Having the clerics come on board and then later kicking them off led to around a half-hour delay between the king's ship and the prince's ship. The prince and the other passengers, who were all highly drunk at this point, decided that they wanted to overtake the king's transport and get to England before him. They went up to Captain Fitzstephen, told him what they wanted, and he, who I would also like to add here, was also completely drunk at this point, decided to go along with their request. This was a very poor decision for a multitude of reasons. See, under normal circumstances, the trip from France to England across the English Channel had a very tried and true path out of necessity for how often the trip was made and how dangerous the channel was. Because the channel was known for its erratic waves and sudden storms, and deviating from the known way through would prove to be quite dangerous for any ship. Um, Another reason why trying to overtake the king would lead to failure was because to do so, the captain decided to head north along the coast, where it was known to have many dangerous rock formations. To top all of this off, it was night, and again, everyone on board was drunk. It should be no surprise to anyone hearing these details that the ship hit a submerged rock off the coast and sank. Only one person of the 300 managed to survive, a butcher by the name of Berold, and his testimony is the only thing that informs us as to any of the events of this night. He said that the prince's bodyguard had actually managed to secure a lifeboat and get the prince on board it. But the prince, hearing the yelling and screaming of his step-siblings and friends, ordered him to go back and to try and save as many as possible. Many claim that it was specifically the danger that his beloved stepsister Matilda Fitzroy was in that made him go back, but there's a lot of embellishment on the actions of any royalty. No matter the reason for doing so, they went back, but the prince was naive in his optimism that he could save anyone. Too many people ended up rushing the lifeboat, leading to it capsizing, and of course, no one except the previously mentioned butcher managed to make it off the ship alive. As gone over before, As gone over before, Prince William was Henry I's favorite child, and Henry was heartbroken when news had reached him of what had occurred in the incident. The loss of the prince was quite mourned. A contemporary of the king, Henry of Huntingdon, chronicled mourning the prince, quote, "Instead of wearing embroidered robes, he was floating naked in the waves, and instead of ascending a lofty throne, he found his grave at the bottom of the sea." End quote. The most important part of this loss was not the personal tragedy, however, it was the succession crisis on the hands of many nobles. Don't forget, Prince William had all of his friends on board with him, and all of them were children of important nobles who would have been able to inherit titles and land. King Henry specifically was lost on what to do in terms of the succession for both England and for Normandy, as it was all thrown into possible dispute. Rules of succession at this time were uncertain. Many different ideas were developing. In many parts of France, the idea that the eldest son would inherit all titles was continuing to become more and more popular. But in Normandy and England, the tradition was for lands to be divided between sons, with the eldest son taking the patrimonial, generally the most important lands, and the younger sons would receive smaller partitions or estates. This becomes even more complicated given the recent unstable history of Anglo-Norman successions, in which there have been no uncontested rule-abiding claims to the throne for decades. And you might notice a problem here. All of these mention the succession rules for men. Henry was in a tight spot because with the death of William Adelin, he only had one other legitimate child, Matilda, otherwise known as Empress Matilda, and the rules for female rights of inheritance at this time were even more nebulous than the ever-changing ones for men. So Henry decided to take a second wife, but having another legitimate son through her looked to be increasingly more and more unlikely, and Henry eventually gave up on that front of having another legitimate child and decided to instate Matilda as heir to the throne. Now, at this time, she had been married to Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor, and claimed the title of Empress from that position. But her husband died in 1125, and in 1128 she was remarried to Geoffrey V, uh, who was controlling a county bordering the Duchy of Normandy that was historically always enemies with the Normans. And this led to Joffrey being rather unpopular with the Anglo-Norman elite. At the same time that nobles were disagreeing with Matilda and her marriage, they were also becoming quite unhappy with King Henry. First, because they were not accepting of the idea of a future female leader, and secondly, because they didn't like some of his current domestic policies, specifically the high rise in revenue that he was collecting for the sake of warfare. Henry I did in fact see all of this discontent brewing. He wasn't blind to it, and he attempted to build support for Matilda and her claim by demanding of his court that they take oaths in which they would accept Matilda and her claim, um, and that they would support her line of children after she passed. Stephen of Blois, a nephew of Henry I, was one of those who did actually swear this oath to her. Nevertheless, the king's work didn't set Matilda and Joffrey at ease, and they suspected that they didn't really have any real support in England. So in 1135, they asked Henry to just hand the Normandy castles over to Matilda while he was still alive, so as to give them a more powerful position after his death, in which they did already control some of the territory that she was supposed to inherit. Um, Henry was not happy with this proposal and rejected it, most citing his reason for doing so being the fear that Joffrey would have been given too much power and it would have given him an easier position in which to seize the whole of Normandy for himself. Directly after this, rebellion broke out in southern Normandy, and Joffrey and Matilda went down there to intervene in support of the rebels against the royal army. They were obviously not very happy with King Henry's decision. So there were tensions brewing from many different factions, and a few weeks later, on December 1st of 1135, Henry I fell ill and passed away. Despite all of his best efforts, the line of succession would still be disputed and would lead to a civil war commonly known as the Anarchy. News of the king's death spread while Joffrey and Matilda were still helping the rebels, many of whom were nobles who supported Matilda and her claim. Unfortunately, these same nobles had also sworn to stay in Normandy until the king had had a proper funeral, meaning they weren't able to return to England during the time period between the king's death and someone claiming the throne. All of this set up the perfect positioning for someone other than Matilda to take the throne, as she and her supporters were all concentrated on the continent. Now, directly after King Henry died, the Norman nobility immediately began discussing seating Theobald of Blois on the throne, but he was also in the unfortunate position of being south in Blois, and his younger brother Stephen of Blois was closer to England than he was. Now, Stephen is one of the more important players in this game. He's the son of Stephen Henry of Blois and Adela of Normandy, a daughter of William the Conqueror, thus making Stephen and Matilda first cousins. His parents allied with King Henry I, and since Stephen was a younger son and would not be able to inherit, he became a part of Henry's court and helped to serve on campaigns. This allowed him to become a well-established part of Anglo-Norman politics, alongside his younger brother, Henry of Blois, who was the Bishop of Winchester. Now, Stephen also gained the lands of Boulogne, doing his marriage to Matilda of Boulogne, and this set him free to be in the convenient position to claim the throne. Um, when he heard of King Henry I's death, he and his entire military household left immediately for England, and they arrived a week later on the 8th of December. He seized power with the help of his brother, but he faced some major issues before he could fully claim the title of king. One of them being the religious oath that he swore, stating that he would support Matilda's claim to the throne. Members of the church were hesitant to support a man that would so easily break an oath sworn to God, but his brother's position as Bishop of Winchester really was a boon to him in helping him out of the situation, because the bishop was seen as respectable within the church community, which led to him being able to convince everyone in the church that Stephen was correct in his breaking of the oath, and that the late king was the one in the wrong by forcing people to take that oath. The other way that Henry of Blois helped was by convincing Henry I's royal steward, Hugh Bigod, to swear that on his deathbed, the late king did in fact nominate Stephen to take the place of Matilda. People believed this, and Stephen allied himself with the church by also promising to grant extensive freedoms and liberties to the church in exchange for the Archbishop of Canterbury and the papacy supporting his succession to the throne. On the 26th of December, 1135, Stephen of Blois was crowned King of England. Immediately after Stephen's coronation, the entirety of his kingdom was thrown into chaos, first starting with the Scottish, who saw the change in power as an opportunity to take the disputed territory of northern England. On the news that Henry I had passed, David I of Scotland, who happened to be the uncle of Empress Matilda, invaded northern England, and actually Stephen managed to resolve this fairly quickly and was able to return south, but in doing so he managed to lose quite a sizable portion of northern England in the settlement. But after he dealt with that, he continued to build himself as the natural successor to the throne by continuing with his promise to support the church. In return, his brother, Henry of Blois, was successful in securing support from Louis VI, who declared support for him, and by getting Pope Innocent II to declare Stephen as king in 1136. After this, though, trouble started up again when South Wales rose in rebellion, and nothing King Stephen sent against them worked to de-escalate it. By 1137, the king, by all appearances, seemed to have abandoned attempts to put down the rebellion and just took it as a loss. Geoffrey of Anjou, again husband to Empress Matilda, attacked the Duchy of Normandy in 1136 and proceeded to raid and burn estates rather than to try and hold any of the territory. See, he had a previous attempt before in which he was promptly pushed back, and this time he decided to just try and cause as much chaos as he could. To get him to stop, King Stephen agreed to pay 2,000 marks to him a year in exchange for peace. In his first 3 years, King Stephen had not had a run as well as he would have hoped. He managed to lose Northern Territory, he abandoned South Wales, he did manage to win peace in an even more destabilized duchy, but only through the use of bribery, not any kind of might. And by 1138, he had managed to empty King Henry I's quite sizable treasury, due to a more lavish court style and the constant military presence and mercenary armies that he was forced to maintain to keep any semblance of peace. Unfortunately for him, this was only the start to his troubles in keeping rule of England. In 1138, the true fighting that marked the beginning of the Anarchy began when Robert of Gloucester, half-brother to Matilda and supporter of her claim, rebelled against King Stephen. He renounced his fealty and publicly declared his support for Matilda, and in doing so, he managed to spark a regional rebellion in the southwest of England despite his own position in Normandy. Geoffrey used this instability to re-invade Normandy, and David of Scotland also capitalized on it to restart his invasion of the north of England in support for his niece. Now, Stephen was faced with a three-prong attack, one from the north, one from Normandy, and one in the southwest. He primarily focused on the revolts and invasions of England. He did manage to defeat the Scots at the Battle of the Standard, but despite that victory, David still managed to hold a majority of northern territory that he had taken. Stephen, however, headed west himself to deal with the rebellion happening there, and he did manage to take back most of the region and put it under his control, except for Bristol, where in response he just raided and pillaged the surroundings. Now, Robert did not end up helping the rebels in the west as they had been expecting him to, because again, he remained in Normandy, and his main goal there was to convince Empress Matilda to invade England. And this led to Stephen eventually gaining control of most of England just in time for proper preparations for an invasion. Matilda had managed to reach a favorable position for herself by gaining most of the Duchy of Normandy due to Geoffrey's basically uninterrupted invasion during the three-prong attack. She and Joffrey had time to build up and mobilize forces while Stephen was still grappling with the troubles in England, and although Matilda's request to the Pope to reverse his support of Stephen as king was rejected, the fact that there was even a rejection to her legal claim still established in Matilda's favor that Stephen's claim to the throne was something that was still in dispute. Now, Stephen was also preparing for war by creating new earldoms to centralize power across England, to have more areas in between stretches of land that were like military might. But he made a major misstep with dealing with the church during this time period. See, bishops were landowners who also commanded some considerable military power behind them, and one of the most powerful of them in England was Roger of Salisbury. The bishops, in response to the current political climate of very near war, had begun to build up their militaries, and King Stephen thought that this was an omen that they would start to defect to Empress Matilda. He wanted them to just lose their military power, and in a situation most likely set up by him, a fight broke out between Roger's men and another nobles, and this led to a situation that he uses the basis for demanding that all of the bishops surrender their English castles to him. He backed this up with the threat of arrest, to which he proceeded to immediately follow up with when they quite reasonably refused to give all of their territory to him. This ended up damaging and basically severing his connection with the senior clergy and hurt his relationship with his greatest supporter up to this point, which was his brother, who was, of course, Bishop of Winchester. On the 30th of September 1139, Robert of Gloucester and Empress Matilda arrived in England with a force of around 140 knights. Matilda ended up staying at Arundel Castle, where one of her sympathizers lived, while Robert ended up going northwest to raise support for their cause. This led to a very strange situation in which Matilda was separated from her main force, and Stephen immediately went after her at the castle and trapped her there. She agreed to a truce where the details aren't really clear, but it allowed her to basically go back to Robert with the few knights that she had with her. There are two main theories that are brought up as to why King Stephen would just let his rival to the throne go, most of which either arguing that he didn't see her as his real opponent because she was a female, or that he just didn't want to waste his army trying to get into the nigh impregnable castle while Robert just roamed around England without any interference. Now, despite Robert's best efforts, not many defected to Empress Matilda, but at the end of the day, she did end up controlling a sizable amount of territory in the southwest, as shown on the map in blue. And again, we're going to have another poor decision made here by Stephen, in which he started to let the nobility get disgruntled. They thought that certain lands belonged to them, and this ended up with someone known as Earl of Chester defecting, and he seized the Lincoln Castle, which would prove to be quite a boon for Matilda, because in 1141, at the Battle of Lincoln, King Stephen ended up on the losing side of the war and was captured. Now, this meant that Matilda could start to prepare herself for gaining the approval of the church and finally making a substantial claim and having her coronation. She ended up making a private deal with Henry of Blois, again King Stephen's brother, who was still upset with King Stephen due to the previous issues that he had with the church. And he promised Empress Matilda that he would gain her the support of the church in exchange for her promising to grant him control of all church business in England once she was in power. He ended up giving the Empress the leftovers of the depleted treasury of Henry I and excommunicated many of Stephen's supporters who refused to switch sides. The clergy did manage to name Empress Matilda Lady of England and Normandy, but on the day of her coronation, she caught wind that basically the entire city of London was quite hostile to her, and she had to flee out of the city to Oxford before she could actually be declared queen. Now, despite the problem with not gaining the title, things were still looking relatively good for Empress Matilda as more and more barons defected to her under the threat of losing their lands to both Robert and Joffrey's forces. It seemed at this point that the only thing keeping Stephen's faction alive during his imprisonment was his wife, Queen Matilda. Henry of Blois soon had a falling out with Empress Matilda and transferred his support back to Queen Matilda, and also had the church undo their support of the Empress's claim. Queen Matilda gained a lot of strength from having Henry of Blois behind her again, and led her forces towards the Empress, leading to Robert being captured at the Row of Winchester. Eventually, an exchange was made between Stephen and Robert, both of them just unleashed from captivity, as no one could settle on an appropriate peace agreement, and the fighting continued again with both military leaders back in place. Around the mid-1140s, the war had started to reach a stalemate, as most of this time period consisted of lands being passed around as one side captured it, and then it was recaptured, and so on and so forth. There was a few points of interest during this, mainly that in 1144, Geoffrey of Anjou managed a major victory as he captured Rouen, the capital of the Duchy of Normandy. And he was declared Duke of Normandy by Louis VII. So this was a major win for him, but this didn't really have much of an effect on the fighting in England, however. The Civil War continued on like this, and by 1147, Robert of Gloucester died peacefully and of completely natural causes. So the main fighting leader for Empress Matilda's side was out of the picture. Eventually, the Empress just returned back to a more peaceful Normandy, and most of the Civil War was over, other than the skirmishes that happened every so often. At one point in 1147, Geoffrey and Matilda's son, Henry Fitzempress, mounted a mercenary invasion of England. That failed, however, just completely stopped, and King Stephen just sent him back home unharmed, and actually ended up paying for the cost of his hired men, as Henry could not pay for it himself. Many think that King Stephen did this in order to show that he wanted a more peaceful end to the war and to try to create a better relationship with Matilda's son. Matilda ended up staying in Normandy for the rest of this time period, just trying to stabilize and correctly govern the duchy, along with promoting her son's rights to the English throne. In 1150, Henry Fitzempress was declared duke by his father, and he started to gain a very positive reputation as a capable leader. See, his power and influence only increased when he married Eleanor of Aquitaine and gained large amounts of French territory. In 1153, Henry tried his hand at invading England again and did find supporters with the Earl of Chester and a few loyal remnants located in the east. And during his campaign, he came to control much of the Southwest, the Midlands, and the Northern Territory. But as it went on, both King Stephen and Henry began to worry about the future of succession. They ended up privately speaking together in the aftermath of a battle at Wallingford, in which they voiced their thoughts about trying to end the war peacefully. This actually came to fruition when King Stephen announced the Treaty of Winchester at Winchester Cathedral, which stated that Henry would be recognized as Stephen's successor and adopted son as long as Henry paid homage to Stephen and allowed Stephen's son William to have security of his own lands and inheritance. On October 25th, 1154, King Stephen passed away and Henry was crowned King Henry II of England on December 19th, 1154, thus ending the period of anarchy.